Hi, Jenni here, and recently I deleted my poetry Instagram account. And in this video I would like to go through my journey as someone who has written poems since I was a child, what has changed and what is the goal from now on. I hope you enjoy this video. Once again, the fan is on so that I don't feel like suffocating. It's still pretty warm here in Finland. Sorry if it bothers you. So I started writing poems when I was very young. I don't remember the exact moment, but I had a notebook in which I wrote poems about animals and about my friends and sometimes about how I was feeling, as a child. Writing poems really helped me as a child when my grandma died, and I wrote about how I felt. From a young age, I've been writing poems. It has always felt like it comes naturally to me, rhyming and thinking of concepts. For poems, my uncle is an incredible poet. He doesn't publish poems, but his writing, in his free time is really beautiful. And also my mom writes poems. And also we're kind of distantly related to Eino Leino, who is one of the most famous Finnish poets, but that's besides the point. I continued on writing poems up until upper secondary school, high school, because I was too busy with my studies to write poems. So that was kind of when I stopped writing, so around 2014, 2015. I then returned to writing poems in my early 20s. I was part of this group therapy thing. I've done many types of therapy, and there we were discussing things that you love to do as a child, but you've given up on them because you don't have time or haven't felt like they were for you anymore. So for me, that was writing poems. So I started doing that again when I was about 21. What was different this time was that I decided to post them on Instagram. Now, I've had a lot of different handles on my poetry account on Instagram since 2018, but I usually marked or nicknamed my poems under the poem as JK because those are my actual initials, unlike for some authors. My name is Jenni Katarina. Yeah, I started posting poems, and at first it was going amazing. Yes, some of the poems looking back are very, very cringe, but they were doing well on the algorithm. My friends were supportive, and it was going well until I started feeling pressure about posting poems, and I forced out a couple of poems, and ultimately I would take breaks. And on social media, you are never allowed to take a break ever. So the algorithm started to hide me more and more. But I still came up with very exciting poetry collections, like smaller collections that I would post on Instagram. And I also wrote a lot of poems, by hand into my notebook or my notes app. And it was a very important part of my life as a 20-something-year-old in my early 20s and going through a lot of difficult stuff. I even self-published a poetry collection called I Am Allowed to Be Angry, in which I go through these turmoils that I was having in my early 20s. It's very vulnerable and a big cringe at times, the poems that I wrote, but it's very honest. But because of the pressure to post on social media, on Instagram, I felt very exposed on my poetry account because I was writing poems about my deepest feelings and very difficult stuff. So I would end up taking breaks for long periods of time and then returning, taking another break. Obviously, the algorithms didn't like that. For about a year or so, I have not touched my poetry account at all. I just didn't have time to write poetry. I was very busy at work when I still had a job. The idea of writing a poem about my really difficult times that I was going through and posting it for everyone to see, it became a bit too much. I did try to post earlier this year. Some people saw them, but it was very clear that the algorithm has abandoned me for being so infrequent at posting. Ultimately, I then decided to delete my Instagram account for poetry because 1, I wasn't posting, and 2, I felt very vulnerable and exposed by all the poems that were on that page because they talked about very very personal details of my life, and I wasn't actively using that account, so they were just kind of collecting dust on this account. So that was ultimately why I decided to delete my Instagram account. I did back up everything, so all of my poems are saved. One thing that I've now recently thought about is wanting to return to writing poetry, but kind of understanding how I'm lacking and how I need to work much harder and write much more to even consider myself a poet. I mean, I used to consider myself a poet because I was writing poetry, but I feel like it requires so much more than that. It was actually Perfect Victims by Mohammed El-Kurd and Puhun Nukke by Helga West that really inspired me. Both of these like personal essay collections, nonfiction books, featured poetry as a way to back up their statements or vision that they were trying to present in each essay. And I just thought to myself, like, wow, I would love to be able to do that as well, but I'm not knowledgeable enough in poetry to do that. Now, granted, I did write my bachelor's thesis on poetry. I analyzed Sappho's and Sor Juana's poetry and compared them, but still, I would like to know more about poetry. So my goal for the future is to read more poetry to become a better poem writer. Not a poet, but a poem writer. Yeah, I do want to say, like, some of the poems I published on my Instagram accounts were actually really good in my opinion. I worked on them really hard. They had very strong concepts, but I wouldn't call myself a good poet based on just that. So my goal is to read the poetry books that I have at home. Last year I read Edith Södergran, a collection of her poems, and I was just amazed by her work and the way she used poetry as a tool to open up about her life and her struggles mentally and physically. Mohammed El-Kurd is an amazing poet. Yeah, I'm gonna read the poem books that I already have again and really delve into them and not just pass through them quickly. I also have a couple of poetry books that I borrowed from the library. I'm not promising to read all of them, but I will try. And we are going back to the basics. I have Shakespeare, the complete sonnets and poems. Of course, I've read Shakespeare for my studies as an English major. I've even taught about Shakespeare to my students when I was still working. Not gonna read this whole thing, but I will familiarize myself with Shakespeare's work again and see how he was as a writer. Very excited. Then I also have Sea Prayer by Khaled Hosseini. I'm not exactly sure if this is considered a poet's book. Maybe it's more like a narrative book in poetic form, but look at this stunning visual walls, illustrations, and it just seemed really beautiful. So I'm gonna read this one as well. Now on to a bit more. I'm not sure if I'm gonna read them, but I borrowed them anyways. Carol Ann Duffy, Elegies. Elegy is like a form of obituary, kind of. It's a very sad poem type about grief and loss, but also like honoring the life someone has had. I don't know anything about Carol Ann Duffy. I just picked this one up because I have tried writing elegies myself. Or is it an elegies? I have tried to write elegies myself as well. So I'm gonna see how Carol Ann Duffy wrote elegies and see if I can come up with something like that as well. Then I have 2 poetry books in Finnish. I don't know much about poetry in Finnish beyond Eino Leino. I have read his work and I will probably reread some of his work again. But I also wanted to read a female Finnish poet. So I got Aila Meriluoto Lasimaalaus in English, A Glass Painting. This was a hugely popular poetry collection when it was released in 1947. And if I've understood correctly, this is about like being young and living through war and so on. So that's one. And the last poetry book I borrowed from the library is Kallas Aino Kuunsilta runoja. So The Bridge of the Moon poems. Aino Kallas is a Finnish writer and poem. I've read her novel Sudenmorsian before. Honestly, I don't know how to translate that into English. Sudenmorsian, The Bride of a Wolf. And I actually analyzed it for one of my literature studies. So I was familiar with her and really liked that book. So I'm excited to see what her writing as a poet is. Yeah, that one as well. I really hope that reading more poetry and actually like indulging myself in them and focusing on the poems and not just reading them quickly, because I feel like often people on book social media think of poetry books as quick reads rather than actually engaging with the material at hand. The goal is to become a better writer and become more knowledgeable in poetry. I don't want to set any goals, but it would be lovely if I could, like, by the end of the year, if I could be able to recite like even 2 or 3 lines of a poem by heart. Maybe that could be doable. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video on poetry. What do you think? Do you read poetry often? Do you write poetry yourself? What makes a good poet in your opinion? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I see you in the next one. Bye!